and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is the fourth episode in our series X-Rated and Animated, The World of Ralph Bakshi, where we'll be digging into the work of a true and controversial auteur of animated cinema. Today we'll be discussing Bakshi's exploration of music, family, and the American dream with 1981's American Pop.
One family.
Some music I love.
4 generations.
This isn't work. This is play.
In love with the sound of American pop. Ralph Bakshi, the creator of Fritz the Cat and Lord of the Rings, now takes modern animation a quantum leap forward with a motion picture of incredible beauty and remarkable power.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody to love.
Whether you dance to it, drive to it, sing with it, or swing with it. If you can crank it up, plug it in, or switch it on. If it assaults your senses, rocks your body, or touches your soul. It's American Pop.
American Pop is a 1981 adult animated musical drama film produced and directed by Bakshi. The film tells the story of 5 generations, or 4 according to Wikipedia, of a Russian Jewish immigrant family of musicians whose careers parallel the history of American popular music in the 20th century.
And like last episode, we're going to just touch on the film that came before this from Bakshi, because we do want to mention it, even though we're not going to focus on it for this episode. We want to just bring it up because it was a big one for him and just a big pop culture film in general. So in 1978, Bakshi was at the helm of a very large epic animated film called The Lord of the Rings. This was his adaptation of the J.R.R. Tolkien high fantasy epic, The Lord of the Rings, obviously. And his film, it basically comprised the Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first novel, and the first half of The Two Towers, the second novel. So he gets essentially halfway through the story, and he did want to tell the entire story because he was a huge fan of the story, and he was very passionate about telling this, even though it wasn't his work, which is something he hadn't done since Fritz the Cat, really. It was work on something that wasn't really his own idea. But I think it's just, Lord of the Rings is such a huge template for fantasy and just fiction in general. So I think he just wanted to be a part of that and give his take on it, and he wanted to complete that take, but unfortunately that was not possible. Even though the film, when it came out, was a financial success, it received a lot of mixed reactions from critics, and for one reason or another it did not receive a sequel, and he was not able to close out the story. So he instead focused on he went back to focusing on a more personal story, which is American Pop.
Yeah, and so American Pop, as we mentioned, tells the story of this Russian Jewish immigrant family of musicians, and it kind of, it's a pretty big story in scope. The way it's told, that was the first thing personally that stuck out to me, is that it is the story of multiple generations, and one thing that jumped out to me immediately that I was pretty fond of was the fact that, Bakshi being a big film lover and historian, kind of use the medium in a different way to tell each generational story. So we open the film in the late 1800s, and I believe the 1890s in Russia during the pogroms, which we don't really have time to unpack now. That's kind of another topic. But basically it was the persecution of Jews in Russia in the late 1890s, which triggered many, many Jewish people moving to the United States. And that whole section is told through a silent film with intertitles and the whole 9 yards. And as we move through the time, the film style kind of changes to reflect what's going on in the particular time period in the world and America specifically.
Yeah. Like you said, Jeremy, it's pretty epic, like pretty grand the story that he's telling is pretty grand, much like Lord of the Rings and like Wizards. He seemed to be evolving more into telling these kind of larger narratives from his first couple of movies. And this movie, I think, is pretty different from anything else he's done. It's a lot more emotional. Actually, Jeremy, before we started recording, you used the word earnest, and I think that's a good word to describe this film. It's probably the most earnest film that we've seen from him this far, even though with Heavy Traffic was, that movie was very personal for him. But this one just feels different. It wasn't written by him. I think might be one reason for that. But it's very clearly Bakshi, but also just, more earnest, more human, ground level, going into these different families, and you just feel like you get to know each of these characters pretty well. And also he brings a bit of history into it, like you mentioned. We start in the late 1890s, so we kind of go from there up until when this film came out, which was 1981. So pretty different from what we had seen before. It's and as the title would suggest, it's pure Americana in certain ways.
Yeah.
And also because it is generations of American fathers that it focuses on, it does give the title a double meaning there. And we get to see these different father-son relationships. And Jeremy, I feel like part of the film, or a lot of what the message of the film is the traditional tale of the sins of the father, coming back to affect his offspring. I feel like that's really a big part of this movie. What do you think?
I think it's interesting, and it might be just that, we're in the first few days of spring here and the sun is shining and I'm in a good mood. But I kind of personally, when I finished this film, it wasn't so much the sins of the father. For me, it was kind of more the story of the sacrifice that a family makes and how so many generations can lead to one person finally breaking through and seeing success, kind of on the heels of the struggle of all the others. So for me, it was a little bit more optimistic than that, I think. Obviously, there were characters in this family who were really imperfect human beings, which I love. I tend to be drawn towards films that have these imperfect characters. But I think that what was interesting for me is that ultimately it seemed like all of them were trying to reach some kind of musical enlightenment. They were trying to find answers to complicated questions of death, of heartbreak through music, but ultimately, be it the time period, be it their own personalities, world events happening, something kind of kept getting in the way of this idea of enlightenment until, spoiler alert, at the very end, the fifth and final generation, who's playing that 1970s rock and roll music, finally kind of breaks through and seems to have transcended and moved up. But to me, I personally interpreted it as a hopeful message that, even though it might not happen right now for somebody, the things that they're doing could down the line lead to eventually something positive happening.
Yeah, in this film, it still has that ethnic flair that we see in a lot of Bakshi's other films. To kind of tie it all together, I mean, it's but even though he has that, it's in a different, more traditional sort of way. He's taking us back in time, and particularly with this one immigrant family of Russian Jewish descent through 4 or 5 generations. So it's a little bit of a different take on his usual, what he usually likes to portray in his films. So, but he's obviously Bakshi's still very interested in the seedy underground of urban life. Because the character, a lot of the characters, well, one of the main characters, Zalmi, he gets involved with some shady gangster characters, and there's a lot of that type of thing in the film, particularly early on. Although obviously it evolves as the times change, and it shows a lot of how violence intrudes in their lives, and we also see, we see factory fires, gangster shootouts, a lot of drug related incidents that happen, and a lot of crime, and these are like the main through lines of the film, as well as sins of the father, or however you want to look at that aspect of it.
What's interesting, though, is that they're portrayed in a different way than they are, as we mentioned, than other Bakshi films. Ironically, the word that I would use is cartoonish. They're much less cartoonish, even though they are, in fact, cartoons. It seems like they're just the weight of the situation. Not that his other films don't take things like violence and heartbreak. Like there's one scene where Zalmi's mother dies in what is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, I believe.
Yeah.
And like in other films, like a Fritz the Cat or a Heavy Traffic,
Hmm.
or even Wizards, something like a big serious event could happen, but the way it's portrayed, be it the animation, or the writing around it,
Yeah.
kind of makes it feel a little bit less consequential and portrayed in a more maybe ironic way, and the
Yeah.
message itself could be hidden in a moment. Whereas in
Hmm.
this film, it feels like the darker elements are more intended to be viewed as just part of this narrative. They're not really supposed to
Hmm.
be making this massive cultural statement. I feel like the statements kind of come from the overarching narrative as a whole.
Yeah. And you also have that through line of the popular music, obviously, which is a big part of this film.
Hmm.
And also the editing. I noticed the editing is very interesting in this movie. For example, like the one sequence where he's cutting between swing dancers and scenes of from the Second World War, with this kind of like jaunty music playing over both kinds of images. Like he does that kind of thing a lot in it. And he builds some really cool momentum and makes some really cool moments out of just the editing of different scenes and juxtaposing. Wow, juxtaposing different images together. There's a lot of that in this movie, and as you said, he does revisit. You talked about Fritz the Cat a little. He does revisit the '60s in this film, and we saw how critical he was of that time period, and with Fritz the Cat, we see it in a little bit of a different light here. I
Yeah.
mean, he's presenting, his certain side of it, but he shows the beatniks and whatnot. But did you feel it was pretty different from Fritz the Cat?
Yeah, well, I feel like Fritz the Cat, and kind of other eras that Bakshi had portrayed. I feel like the difference between those and this particular film is that we have really much more of a backstory. I think that in something like Fritz the Cat or Heavy Traffic, we're kind of just thrown into that world and maybe don't have sympathy or empathy for the characters and people who found themselves in it. Whereas in this film, for example, because we have the reference point of Fritz the Cat, when we see our characters kind of diving into that hippie world, we're seeing them coming from something that is leaving them feeling kind of empty. So it's leaving them feeling empty and wanting answers. And at that particular time, the place to find answers seemed to be that hippie movement. It seemed to be going to San Francisco, moving
Yeah.
west, that kind of free, off the rails life. In a way that I
Hmm.
think Fritz the Cat understood, but it didn't seem like Fritz was in pain. It didn't seem like
Hmm.
Fritz was struggling. It felt
Hmm.
like Fritz was bored. Whereas for the characters in this particular film, it feels a lot more like it
Earnest,
came a
like you
lot
said,
more from,
pretty
yeah,
much.
it was a grittiness to it.
Yeah, more gritty, a little more earnest, like you said, portrayal of the different time periods, particularly the '60s, which I think is pretty, a contrast to what we saw in Fritz the Cat, obviously in a lot of ways. And also, he shows the technology. As the years progress, there's kind of that same message from Wizards. So I noticed where, he's showing how TV takes over in the one scene where he's like yelling at his family to stop watching the television and stop staring at the tube all day. So, he has little commentaries like that throughout, which is kind of cool. Like in addition to the story and the music, he has little things like that. And also the film gets more psychedelic as the music gets more psychedelic as well, which is kind of cool. And you really see some cool editing stuff going on especially towards the end of the film, I would say. And he goes all the way up to, the punk and the new wave movement, which was prevalent when the movie was released, obviously. But I think we would be remiss to talk about this film and not talk about two things. I want to talk about both of these things in their own little sections here. So first, I want to focus on the rotoscoping, and then I want to talk about the music. So first, the rotoscoping. We've seen rotoscoping, which is an animation technique, as we described it before, which is essentially tracing over, or not tracing, but I mean, it's essentially
Kind of tracing,
right?
yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting
over
it.
over live action footage, to make animation that is presented in a sort of interesting way. It looks realistic, yet it's still sort of surreal because it's not real, because it's still animation. So he's used that technique before, a little more sparingly, but this film, he went full on. The entire film is rotoscoped, so from start to finish. Basically, all of the animation is rotoscoped animation, and he was starting to use it a lot more, particularly in the Lord of the Rings adaptation he did.
Hmm.
There's a lot of rotoscoping done there, and we talked about it in Wizards, and he's always kind of mixed it in, but this time he really went for broke with it, and that was a stylistic choice that I think really makes sense for this movie.
Yeah.
How'd you feel about it in this context?
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed the rotoscoping in this film. I think more than in the other films that we've seen from
I
him.
feel like it makes more sense in this one in a way.
It makes more sense, but also I just think he got better at it. Like we're seeing the progression of an artist here, and to me, like in the other in Wizards, the rotoscoping would happen, and I would notice that it was rotoscoping.
Yeah.
Whereas here, I honestly didn't really find myself thinking about the rotoscoping as I was watching it.
Also, that might have something to do with the whole film being rotoscoped too. You kind of just get used to it
Yeah.
as you're watching it. Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps, but also I think that it just kind of felt really refined to me. It felt like it was rotoscoped for a really, it felt really intentional. It didn't feel like it was to fill anything in, because there were certain moments in Wizards, which I really enjoy. I think they're interesting, but it feels a little pieced together, like maybe it was a solution to a problem, but not
Like
necessarily
his budgetary issues and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, whereas in this, it just feels like from the beginning they said this is what we're doing, and they totally stuck to it. It was clear and
Yeah.
controlled the whole time.
Right. And he still employs the other techniques we've talked about, like live footage, archival footage, stuff like that. But the rotoscoping is really what sticks out in this film, and it adds that a very naturalistic effect, which, as I said, I think works really well for this film. And I think Bakshi, if you listen to him talk about this technique in interviews, I find it very interesting because he's had a sort of love-hate relationship with rotoscoping, and I think that's for different reasons. I think, well, that's kind of a whole nother discussion, but he kind of sees it, maybe not cheating is not the right word, but he kind of sees it as maybe like a lesser form of animation, or something that he experimented with because he was interested in it, but in certain ways he regrets relying on it so much now. But again, for this movie, the story that he's telling with the different families and how ground level everything is and how humanistic everything is, the technique just makes so much sense here. And it's not the type of technique that I think is appropriate for every animated movie. Obviously, like I don't think every animation should look like this.
Yeah.
But here I feel it's very much in line with the story that the filmmakers are telling. And also, he rotoscoped some actual footage, so he's mixing even more there. So, like he did in Wizards, where he would draw over wartime footage and things like that. In this film, he would use old movies. Some of the gangland scenes are rotoscope footage from the movie The Public Enemy from 1931, which is a gangster movie there. So, and the stock footage also makes a lot of sense here, I think. Right, the way he uses it, because he's also kind of touching on a lot of moments in history. So the way he weaves that together, it's really overall, it just creates this really nice effect, and it's like there's something very, which is obviously I think what he was going for, but something very nostalgic about this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that technique of weaving in the stock footage and that kind of thing, what it called to mind for me is have you seen Adam McKay's movies, like his more like Vice and The Big Short?
No, I haven't seen those.
Yeah, so they're definitely worth checking out. And Adam McKay is a director who kind of at the beginning he was known. He directed Anchorman. He directed Step Brothers. He was kind of known for doing those comedies, but in the past few years he's had this kind of career renaissance where he's done a couple more political films. Vice being about Dick Cheney and The Big Short being about the economic crash in the mid to late 2000s. But he incorporates a lot of stock footage. He has a very maximalist style. And I can't help it. There's just a very similar feel to the way that Bakshi does it. So it's interesting to me. It's just that these techniques that Bakshi is using and the way he chooses to tell his story still are really relevant today and being used in popular film all the time.
And also the to go back to rotoscoping for a moment, I just something else I thought of when I was watching the movie. It's the fluidity of the movement. It just makes a lot of sense with this movie, like with all the dancing that he shows. Like I mentioned, the swing dancing scene. Just seeing that, and that's a technique. When rotoscoping was first used, it was very early on. I'm probably going to get the dates wrong, but I remember seeing it in cartoons, black and white cartoons from like the 20s and 30s. You know what I mean? Like they
Yeah.
would use it, and they probably even used it before that, as a way of kind of drawing over footage to make it look real or realistic.
I mean,
Um,
early even the films with Millier and all that, they were
yeah, they were
coloring the
doing that
films
kind
by
of
hand. So
right.
not exactly rotoscoping, but same idea.
Same idea, yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of those early cartoons, they would utilize actors dancing. Like there's a very famous example of Cab Calloway, in I believe it's a Betty Boop cartoon. I might be getting that wrong as well, but I'm pretty sure. And so he's dancing and doing his thing. He had very noticeable, like very signature moves, and they were able to capture that through a character that they were animating by tracing over his movements. So that tradition goes way back, and I think Ralph Bakshi was using it here to a really good effect because so much of this film is focused on the music, and so to get that really fluid movement of the dancing, it just really helped tell his tale, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing you mentioned, moving from the rotoscoping, was the music.
Yeah.
And
Yes, the music.
I think the music in this movie it's kind of wild. From what I understand, he called in a lot of favors and got a lot of discounts on this because the soundtrack to this movie
I know.
is
It's crazy.
unbelievable. Like it
Yeah.
is like on its own, just this collection of music, you could fill an hour and a half, and it would be a great hour and a half. Like
Which just shows you the cred that Bakshi had at this time. I mean, he was essentially a legend, like a cult legend, but a legend, and a lot
Yeah.
of people really respected him. The fact that he was able to get these songs, yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, and
These
what's
artists
interesting
involved.
is it was kind of also like even like Jimi Hendrix songs and all that like that. I mean, this came out in 1981, so Hendrix had passed away at this point. So that means a lot of these songs are coming from people's estates. So
Yeah.
it's not even just like an artist to artist connection. It's like people even surrounding these artists felt passionately about having this music be in this film. Um, and it's so interesting because like as we mentioned before, the style of the film kind of matched the era, but the music of the film really kind of defines the era. Of course, it's a movie about music, but I think that it's really kind of a special thing because you see that in a lot of films where oh, it's the 1950s, so let's play a Bobby Vinton song or something like that in like a logical way. But I think in this particular film, the music really details change. The music is its own character. It's not something that's in the background just to give the
Yeah.
era a certain feel. It's right at the forefront of how these characters' lives are changing and how the times are changing.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, for example, like when you hear Jefferson Airplane or you hear The Doors, I mean, you think of a certain time period. Obviously, the time that these artists were active, but it just brings you right back to a certain time, and he uses that to a really great effect in this movie. So he uses actual songs, but fictional characters, which I found interesting as well, which really allowed him to tell his own story. So it wasn't like he was telling the story of Janis Joplin or Bob Dylan or any of these people. He was just telling his own story with his own characters, but they were obviously very heavily influenced by these real life people.
Yeah, totally. And I think that influence and the fact that these characters were playing songs that we're familiar with helps make them more relatable. This is kind of a weirdly unrelated thing, but the other day I had a free night and I grew up in the 90s, so I'm a big Pokemon fan, and I went and saw Detective Pikachu, which recently came out as we sit here on May 21st, 2019. And I think that like one thing that I realized was that going into it, I already felt connected to the characters, because it was something familiar, it was something warm that I had grown up with. And I think that by making the fictional characters in this story be responsible for writing and playing songs that we already know and love, it personally helped me relate to them.
Yeah.
It's like a sense of familiarity that, oh, even though, this is a Jefferson Airplane song, that because this character is now writing it, because Jefferson Airplane is expressing certain things that I'm already familiar with, that it really helped me dig into that character and their story because it gave that sense of commonality.
Yeah.
It wasn't a character that I had to totally learn and discover. It was a character that already had something in common with me because
Yeah.
of that.
And it also makes you look at the lyrics and the music itself in a different way, I think, because we've heard
Yeah.
these songs, a lot of these songs, we've heard them so many times, like,
Hmm.
it's like Somebody to Love or something like that. You've just heard in so many different ways and on the radio and movies. But in this movie, it's just you're relating it to the story that he's telling. And
Hmm.
you can tell that so much of the focus is really on the music. So it kind of makes you take a step back and really look at it and really listen, which is kind of cool. Did you have a favorite musical moment, Jeremy, in the movie, or like the way a song was used?
I mean, it's not a particularly special, wild like story moment. I love the Jimi Hendrix scene. I mean, I'm a huge Hendrix
That
fan,
was cool.
and
Yeah, that was really cool.
I just love that they just let the music go and just had that it really, to me, that was
Mm-hmm.
a testament to Hendrix as a guitar player, but it also, I think, kind of
Mm-hmm.
communicated this feeling. It was shot from that low angle, and basically the moment
Mm-hmm.
that's happening in the film is that the band that our character, I believe that's Tony, right?
I
Is
believe so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this character Tony is a songwriter for, is getting ready to go on after Jimi Hendrix. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was in high school, I was in a band, and there was that moment sometimes where you would see a band play before you, and they just totally kill it and do this amazing job, and then you're
Yeah.
getting ready to go on. It's horrifying, and I think
Imagine going on after Jimi Hendrix.
yeah,
I can't even.
but it
Yeah.
applies for anything. If you're at a film
Right.
festival and your film is showing and
Mm-hmm.
you're on next, or literally anything. And I love that the way that Hendrix was portrayed in that moment, as
Yeah.
literally, you couldn't make a cartoon character look more godlike than
Yeah.
Jimi
He's like from
Hendrix looked in
another
that
world,
moment.
really. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and so to me, it just really stood out because
Yeah.
that was every, to me, that kind of encapsulated how brilliant Bakshi is, and how just by
Mm-hmm.
using color, line, shape,
Yeah.
and sound, he can just totally immerse you in a moment. It was really a powerful thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Mark? Any specific?
Yeah, there is a specific moment, but just going off what you were talking about, I just want to add one little thing there. It's also really cool, like what you mentioned that they go on after Hendrix. Just thinking about that, like it's cool how this movie portrays the little guy,
Yeah.
and like how because a lot of these movies would be focused on Hendrix,
Hmm.
but they're focused on the band that goes after Hendrix, and in real life, someone had to go on after Hendrix,
Yeah.
but we don't know anything about those people, right?
Hmm.
So this movie kind of again, it brings you a different perspective than you would normally see, which Bakshi is great at. And to answer your question, a music moment for me, actually my favorite music moment. I'm actually not sure if he's even playing a real song. I would have to look that up. But the scene where he's playing the piano, one of the character that's in World War II, is that Tony
Uh,
actually?
no, that's not
Um,
Tony. That is Tony's
that was the one
father.
before him,
Yeah.
Tony's father. When he's playing the piano, it's actually right in the middle of the war. He just finds this piano in like a bombed out house, I guess, and he just sits down and after or during the battle, I guess, and he starts playing, and a Nazi soldier is sneaking up behind him, and the music is just so beautiful that it momentarily stops the Nazi in his tracks, and he just kind of stands there and just stares and listens to the music, and once the song's over, he says thank you or danke, and then shoots him, and then I don't know. I just thought that scene was really powerful, and it really shows the power of music as well, which is something that I think he was trying to get across.
Yeah, that is a strikingly beautiful scene and moment.
Hmm.
And I think,
Yeah.
once again, very Bakshi, this idea of the little bit of beauty in the midst of
Hmm.
a
Mixed
pretty
with the realism.
harsh, terrifying world.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, yeah. No,
Yeah, just that little moment was pretty.
it
Pretty
is
nice, I
interesting
thought.
because this definitely isn't Bakshi's most famous film. This is one of the films that was critically really well received for him. Maybe even the best reception
Although this
across
this
the board.
this movie is it is Kanye West's favorite musical apparently.
Yes, yeah. So
That was one of the trivia things I saw about it.
well,
Just
so
something pretty
the music video for
Yeah.
what's the song?
was it
Heartless. I want to say Love
Heartless, yeah.
Lockdown. The music video for Heartless uses the rotoscoping and animation techniques in almost exactly the same way
It's like a very obvious homage, yeah, to
the
this
back
movie.
shit. And I could see, I mean, you could see how someone because Kanye West, before he was famous, was kind of an underdog kind of character, and you could see how
Hmm.
someone who
Yeah.
like Kanye West, who has a deep connection to family and these big musical dreams that he feels he probably won't get to live out unless he is his absolute best and is perfect with it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you could see how someone like that, and you could see how anyone with a dream could connect to this movie, and that is what I think is so American about it. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
personally have a soft spot in my heart for Americana imagery and
Mm-hmm.
American stories, and I think that you know this story is kind of the essence of what it means to be American, you know, always kind of chasing the
Yeah.
this I don't want to use the word dream even, but just this idea that if you work hard and you play your cards right, that things could work out in your favor. But
Mm-hmm.
really not knowing, you know, not knowing exactly what playing your cards right means. And sometimes you do what you think is right and everything goes horribly wrong, and sometimes you do what you know, things that you don't think are going to work out, but they play out perfectly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I really think Bakshi and the writer of this film, who we would be remiss if we don't mention, Ronnie Kern is the writer of this film. They really tapped into that. I think they tapped into that idea of uh, the American story.
Mm-hmm. Other than the Jimi Hendrix moment, was there anything else that really stood out to you, or that you wanted to talk about from this film?
Um, Yeah, I think just this is a weird kind of side note and parallel. But for some reason I kept thinking of Forrest Gump during this movie
Oh yeah, totally.
while I was
I can see
watching
that.
it.
Yeah, for
I'm
sure.
not sure if this had any
Yeah.
influence. But to my knowledge, I can't really. I guess maybe like It's a Wonderful Life kind of had a similar thing where it's this
Mm-hmm.
character over a long period of time and every major world event seems to influence them. But to
Yeah.
me, the difference between this and a Forrest Gump is that I kind of really believe this, you know, because it was multi generational. Um,
Yeah.
this felt like it could like obviously they are affected by a lot of major events, but they you know it didn't feel like an unrealistic series of events to me
Yeah.
the way this went.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of Forrest Gump is played more for laughs, I guess, or a little bit more exaggerated. But this is
Yeah.
very, very ground level, very street level. Yeah. So just like a different take on that kind of idea, um, which is interesting because Forrest Gump has him meeting different famous people like John Lennon and Richard Nixon and stuff like that. So you get some of that here, although it's more like those people are in the periphery. They don't really ever get to meet. It's like they're almost crossing paths, but not really. So it's kind of cool in that way. A little more subtle version of that story, I would say. Um, and there was one other scene I wanted to talk about because we talk about the power of music and how he portrays that. There's one other scene that kind of I thought was very powerful and maybe kind of take notice was when Zalmi, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
Mm-hmm.
he when he is he gets married to this woman Bella, who he's trying to help become a famous singer, and he's getting involved with all kinds of shady characters and mobsters and whatnot. And there's a scene where she receives a package, so it's a delivery, and she goes into the other room, and Zalmi's sitting at the piano, and we just hear the explosion go off because it was a mail bomb sent by, we don't know exactly who, but somebody in the some mobster or someone who wanted to. It was probably meant for Zalmi the explosion, but
Mm-hmm.
it ends up killing his wife, and so it's a very traumatic moment. But the way that it's treated is so interesting. He just keeps sitting at the piano, doesn't even look behind him. I don't think he just starts banging the piano,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's like this scene transition, like along with a time jump. It just like jumps ahead in time.
Yeah.
It's just like really really cool the way that he presented that scene. I thought.
Yeah, and how the
Yeah.
trauma keeps going back into the music. You know, the pain and the struggle. It all comes down to
Yeah, it's
how it
like he
translates.
interweaves. Yeah, he interweaves like the music with these moments and with
Hmm.
these stories and
Yeah.
these families, and yeah, it's what do you think about the way it ended? That's the last thing I wanted to ask you about, is that kind of ending montage they have there. What do you think about that with our last character that we focus on?
I enjoyed the ending
I
personally.
thought it was cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, after all of that, you know, you could have it not pay off. You know, it could
Yeah.
have just been another kind of lost cause. But I think that the final character that we saw, he was a little bit more hardened than all the others had
Hmm.
been. because it's a generational trauma kind of thing, but it seems like he was
Yeah.
the first one who really channeled the trauma into the music. It seemed like the other ones,
Yeah,
like
definitely.
the music was always there, and
Mhm.
it was almost like you wanted to just grab them and say, no, just go play your music.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like it got like a little bit closer through each generation.
Mhm.
And finally it's like, oh, this guy has taken all of these experiences and is
Mhm.
now finally like using the art. He's using the passion and putting it into something productive that's good that he can share
Mhm.
and with the world and tell his
Yeah.
story.
It's almost like a release for him. That's how I saw
Yeah.
it. It's like through all these generations, it's
Hmm.
like, they keep falling on hard times as family, and this main character that we end with, whose name is Pete. So he's Tony's son, and Tony ends up just leaving him and walking out on him, pretty much soon after Pete learns that Pete reveals to him that he knows that he's his father, because
Yeah.
Tony's just been essentially taking care of this kid and not really saying anything, letting him know that he's his father. And then so he eventually, he pawns Pete's guitar and just leaves and never comes back. So it could have ended on a really down note, but I think the fact that they end with that last little montage and him performing the song, yeah, it's a great release, and it's a great, like, I think, just closing segment for the film. It really ends on a really cool note there.
Yep.
And they have some images of his ancestors, I think, like flash on the screen and stuff like that, or appear like as he's performing, which is kind of cool, like a way
Yeah.
to tie everything together. So yeah, really cool movie. I really liked revisiting it, even more than I think the first time I saw it. I think I just appreciated it a lot more, especially looking at all his films together in the series that we're doing. I think seeing this movie again made me realize just how different it is from everything else that he did, and how sort of genuine and earnest, like you said. I think that's a good way to describe how this film comes across.
Yeah.
Um,
I think this is a
yeah.
good film. I mean, it's a good film for anyone to see. I think this is a good film for adult if you haven't seen it. Um, I think it's a good film, at least personally. I'm glad I saw this for the first time as an adult, because I think that there is a certain perspective that you have once you get through your younger years. And for me, at least
Yeah.
personally, watching this, also it's a little near and dear to my heart because my lineage, goes back to Jews in Russia. So like
Right.
literally, like not that my life parallels this, but that my
Yeah.
ancestry, for I guess, kind of parallels it.
Hmm.
But it kind
Yeah.
of gave me an appreciation um, for my own family and
Hmm.
what they must have had to go through to just get by, and the things that the stories that you never hear because there wasn't the same kind of record keeping. But knowing that at some point, people in your own family way back when were making sacrifices and going through difficult things
Hmm.
to get you to where you are right now. And to me, that's a really special thing.
Yeah, in a way, this is his most adult film, I think. Adult animated film.
Yeah.
They always talk about how Bakshi made adult animated, adult cartoons or whatever you want to call them. Like when Fritz the Cat first came out, that was a big promotional thing. It's like X-rated cartoon. But this is, yeah, I mean, it just, like you said, watching it when you're older, I think you just kind of connect with it in a different way, with all the nostalgia and the music and the family and all of that. There's something about it, just very, very grown up. His most grown up film, I would say. So, very cool movie to check out. And next time we will be closing out our series by talking about the last big movie, even though it was a failure. But we would be remiss not to talk about it because it was a big one for him in a lot of ways. His most mainstream in almost all the ways besides Lord of the Rings. So we're going to focus on that next time, and that is Cool World. So for now, I just want to say thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult, and you can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.